talk more about those backlogs, Canada's complicated immigration system, and what's just been announced at the Summit of the Americas on migration, I'm joined now by Immigration Minister Sean Fraser. Welcome back to the House.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, we're glad to have you. I'd like to start with the Los Angeles Declaration signed at the Summit of the Americas. It talks about expanding legal pathways to address the migration issues in the region by, and I'm quoting here, changing the ways people migrate. How do you do that?
Well, there's a number of different ways that we can focus on promoting regular migration pathways. It'll be no secret to those who watch issues of migration that irregular migration through Central America into the United States and indeed onward to Canada is actually something that we need to monitor. The kinds of things that we do include a mix of policies that will help address the root causes of migration, that will establish and facilitate regular pathways so people know what the rules are and understand that they may have a legal pathway to Canada, and to make sure that you have a system that people can depend upon, knowing the rules will be enforced, and that gives them an opportunity to migrate under a set of rules that are clearly understood in advance.
Okay. It also says that Canada is going to accept 50,000 seasonal farm workers from Mexico, Guatemala, and the Caribbean. Doesn't Canada already accept that number?
Year to year, it varies. Our programs that are designed to address temporary employment opportunities in Canada don't currently have a cap. So it's driven by employers, not necessarily by regional or country-specific quotas. So in that way, we've created a bit of certainty for the source countries. I've had the opportunity to meet with my Guatemalan counterpart in particular when I visited the region a number of months ago, and this kind of certainty was a major priority for them. So to continue to work with the partners who have a reliable history of providing talented workers who earn money in the Canadian economy and then bring expertise back to their home country to develop their industries, it gives a little bit of certainty around the partnership where it's previously been driven almost exclusively by employer demand.
I want to ask one more question about this before turning to the broader question of immigration, and that's the 4,000 refugees we're promising to bring in from the Americas by 2028. That seems like a fairly small number. Why isn't it larger?
You know, this is an interesting thing in global perspectives, Chris. That might seem like a small number to Canadians because we have such an incredible history of welcoming such large numbers. But one of the things that you've got to keep in mind is when we're dealing with regions, including the Americas, that have a history of using regular migration pathways, the total number of people who might be coming to Canada could be significantly larger. We just discussed, for example, the temporary foreign worker program that's providing an opportunity for people to actually earn a living in the Canadian economy when we need workers. And that's the kind of thing that actually reduces the likelihood of people coming to seek asylum or to seek refugee status if they're applying from abroad. By global standards, thousands of refugees being resettled from a specific region and having that commitment for people is actually a fairly extraordinary thing. We're going to continue to work with our partners in the region to promote regular migration, but also to make sure that the region knows that we want to participate in the resettlement of people who have humanitarian needs.
We spoke to some experts on the immigration system as a whole. And one of the things they talk about is that the process to immigrate to Canada is too complicated. There's too many pathways. How do you make it easier and quicker for people who want to settle in this country?
So there's a number of different things that we can do to address this, and really it's a question of resources, of policies, and of technology. When it comes to resources, I'm happy to share that we've hired more than 500 new staff fairly recently and have pumped enormous amounts of money in the recent economic and fiscal update and federal budget. Make sure that we actually have the horsepower to process large numbers of cases. On the policy point of view, we have now launched the most ambitious immigration levels plan to create more spaces for people so they don't just understand the process, but know that there is room for more of them when they want to come. Of course, there's hundreds of other policies we can do to facilitate the entry of people into Canada. But on the technology side, when I was first appointed as minister, one of the biggest surprises to me was the extent to which our immigration system in Canada remains paper-based. I'm so thrilled to be leading the largest digital transformation of the entire immigration system in Canada with some new features that have already come online.
No, I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt, but I do understand because you've talked about some of these things in the past. I'm just trying to get a sense from you of how you can streamline a process that many people find too complicated.
Well, right now, the challenges that we're dealing with are largely temporary in nature because they're driven primarily by shutdowns of the system that occurred in Canada and around the world as a result of COVID-19 and the additional pressures that our contributions to the resettlement efforts in Afghanistan and Ukraine have put on the system. As we see those particular exogenous shocks to the system begin to stabilize, we're actually processing people faster today than at any point in Canada's history. Actually, this conversation is well timed. This week, we actually resettled the 200,000th permanent resident this year, more than a month and a half ahead of any year on record in Canada. We're seeing similar trends across other lines of business, like citizenship, like work permits, which are in many instances more than double the usual rate of processing. So when I see the numbers internally, I see that we're starting to turn this corner, pending further impacts of COVID or humanitarian crises. And when we put the resources into the system, adopt the policies, and use the new tech, I don't want to be repetitive of things I've talked about in the past, but I say it again because that's the real answer here. By embracing these kinds of policy decisions and resources and technology, we're actually going to be able to speed up the system and get more people into Canada in a more reliable and expeditious way.
You mentioned the larger numbers of permanent residents being recognized. We spoke to a young student from India who got his permanent residency last week under the temporary residence program to the permanent resident program, the TR to PR program, as you refer to it. It doesn't exist anymore. Are you going to relaunch that?
So the TR to PR program, just so people understand where it's come from, was a response to a very specific change that had to be made during the pandemic when the border was shut down to protect communities against the spread of COVID-19 across Canada. We pivoted our strategy to resettle people who were already in Canada on a temporary basis so we could continue to reliably grow our population and add more permanent residents.
So why not continue it?
Well, it's a good question, actually, because we are looking right now at the best path forward to create a permanent pathway for temporary residents. This is actually one of my mandate letter commitments, and I want to give a particular thank you to my friend and colleague, Randeep Sarai, the Member of Parliament from British Columbia, who's responsible for Motion 44. That actually puts me on a clock to come up with a framework to establish this new permanent residency pathway, not just for international students, also for temporary foreign workers. We're in the depths of planning the policy so we can have a policy that's not driven by a need to respond urgently in the face of an emergency, but actually to have a permanent pathway that provides a clearer path for those seeking permanent residency who enter Canada on a temporary basis.
So is that a yes then, that there will be another TR to PR program?
It won't be identical to the same policy that was in place on an emergency basis. There will be a permanent residency pathway for those people that I've described who are here on a temporary status.
Part of the lesson from the pandemic was that while we put a greater emphasis as a country on people who are highly skilled, that it turned out that some of the people we needed most were the people who worked as cashiers, for example, and personal support workers. So is there a way to address that inequity to ensure that there's an equal access or equal opportunity, if I can put it that way, for people who have those kinds of backgrounds as opposed to the highly skilled people we've been targeting?
But let me tell you, I absolutely hate the description of a low-skilled worker. If this pandemic has taught us anything, it's that a lot of the people that many have described as low-skilled workers are essential workers. They take care of our families. They keep food on the shelves. They keep the supply chains intact. I'm so thrilled because actually just this week, when the House of Commons passed the Bill C-19, the Budget Implementation Act, one of the lower profile items that is part of that piece of legislation has a fundamental change to the way our express entry system operates in Canada. The express entry system takes people based on their human capital score, a series of factors like education, age, work experience, and other factors. The change will allow us to actually more specifically target the greatest needs in the economy on a regional basis and on a sector-by-sector basis. With this new flexibility, we'll be able to identify the greatest needs in the economy. And if I decide as the minister or my successors who will have this flexibility as well, make a decision to target healthcare workers in my home province of Nova Scotia, or construction workers in Ontario, or someone in another high-need profession in a different region of Canada, will for the first time be able to have a targeted draw on those sector-specific bases on a region-by-region basis.
One last question for you. Some of the concerns being raised about exceeding the targets, as you spoke about earlier, for immigration so far this year, is whether there are adequate supports for people to meet their needs. And I'm like getting a doctor, for example, language training, those sorts of things. Are you confident that as the numbers go up, you can do that?
Well, we set the numbers with that absorptive capacity in mind. We can't bring more people into the country than the country is prepared to set up for success. We work with the settlement sector across Canada to understand on a community by community and a province by province basis what numbers we're actually able to successfully resettle, and then we properly fund through a formula we have with more than 550 settlement organizations across Canada to make sure we have the supports in place for things like language training, assistance in finding a job, making sure people have access to health and education resources. This is a really well thought out way to establish immigration targets, but we know we need to keep growing the number of people who are coming to Canada to fill gaps in the labor force and to frankly address a very troubling demographic trend with our aging population if we're going to be able to sustain services that we depend on. So we do this in a thoughtful way to make sure that as we increase the numbers, we similarly and simultaneously increase the settlement resources available to newcomers to Canada.
All right. Immigration Minister Sean Fraser, thanks for your time today. Really appreciate it.
A pleasure as always. Thanks for having me.